Thank you. Hello. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jos. I'm a poet, as was mentioned, author of 2 books, most recently Field, which is what we'll be focusing on. Oh, we're already starting. Today. First, I want to say, thank you all for coming, for everyone who set this up, for everyone who's going to clean up after us, to Lindsay, to Jamie, to Miriam, for everyone for just making this event happen, and of course to the Chicago Humanities Festival. This afternoon, I'd like to primarily lead you through that work Field, to speak some to the graphic and visual elements there. But at the core, I want to give you a reading and introduction to the work. Before that, however, given this topic at hand, when I saw graphic, I thought of this project that I had started and have yet to realize fully, that exists in 8 hand-drawn and handwritten panels. I've prepared some things to say about them that I hope will illuminate them, sure, but I hope also contextualizes what follows about Field and will preliminarily give us a sense of the graphic and how I approach it in my work, its relationship to poetry more broadly, but most specifically to Field. I was thinking of comics when I started this. I was trying to think of the comic, the poem. And there's 8 panels that you'll see. They form something like a kind of exploration of a space. And then I've written a few words here that I'll go through. The word begins long before syntax, use, reflection, thought, or even a body, but in a place. That place may have walls, as here, a smooth length of alabaster, a window showing, a wave, the sun. I mean to be material here. There is breath and resonance. Voice requires both those. The poet, astoundingly, in reading a poem is not needed. Reading a poem, too, requires neither. I think of here, looking at this, of Augustine in awe before Ambrose, reading, walking, not moving his lips. At the time, or so we are told by Augustine in the Confessions, people would come all around to see this person, Ambrose, walking around, not vocalizing while reading, who knew how to speak word without breath, word without place. Yet even he, walking that hall or plaza, may very well have come upon, say, a table, a window, may have seen his sisters and brothers gathering, whose voices filled the place, whose place supplied the resonance to allow for their voices to be heard by him, as he tried, anxious to fulfill that unreachable wonder, to read alone, without breath, without place, while being within a place and within a breath. The scene, being with these others, undercuts as an image his claim to silence. One cannot read alone, commune with another without place, without breath, at least the time of breath, the time of place, its rhythms and lines, without sitting down with or standing among others, without a crowd, like us here today, adjacent and watching perhaps, attesting to the wonder, or elsewhere, excluded at other tables, on floors, by incident or intent. I remember last year placing my watch, the watch I wear now, on a desk, writing a letter, and thinking on Paul Celan's poem, Brief und Uhr, and sealing a letter, and then walking towards the Pacific. But then I turned back to the world. I shoved the letter the following day into a drawer of sorts, and I remember in the book Under the Dome Walks with Paul Celan, Giselle, when her husband Paul had gone missing, when he had thrown himself into the Seine, and though no one knew, she found his watch on his desk, among his torn papers, and knew. Paul was dead, she told Jean. What Jean says of Giselle, I felt it then, the meridian, the coil, the shadow lying half on, half off the table. There is an awe in finding even precisely what one is looking for. Spirals, coils, these have a distinctive quality to me. They appear to be, from one angle, fixed and still, calm things. But from far away, one might mistake it for a point, alone, cold in space, yet also, like a spiral staircase, from one side, it leads us to another level, whose verticality is a question of where one begins. And one returns ultimately to where one began, but now able to look over some edge, down or up, to face it. All these drawings come from a sort of book that I know I may very well never write. I keep a catalog of books in my mind like this that I know I will never write. Some are practical, considered, develop, while others remain like a horizon, something definite, but only as a kind of limit, necessary for the other activity, the writing that does get produced, the domestic, in the chamber, a letter written at a desk. In this way, they are unreachable texts. One I hold close is a novel concerning a boat. I made all these drawings after having tried to write that novel. It would be a novel, though, however, not about people on the boat. It would not be about the journey, the narrative that the boat might or does take. Nor would it be about a lack of narrative, for example, meant to indicate writing as such, narrative, image, sort of through its negation, show what the book ought to have been. But it would just be about one wave coming up to the boat passing over it, and another wave, and then another. A boat, its parts, its passing through. It would just begin and end, and nothing would be new. Once, when I tried writing this work, the one about the boat and the waves, I found myself falling into this trap. Between the two waves, I wrote, trying to exhaust it, every encyclopedic detail of the ship as it was then, between those two moments, knowing that between the following wave and the next, a new boat would come, a new situation. But there is a problem here of time, of repetition. A kind of speaker emerged. I felt it. The wave became a metaphor. Repetitions began to mark time. The hour became familiar and a way into something like a subjectivity. That the boat suddenly felt alive, capable of narrative. But being denied it, like naming a car only to crash it, receiving a childhood blanket only to no longer recognize the smell. I had 3 drafts of this particular panel. This was draft number 3. Everything was different in each one but the light that you see on the wall. One was light on waves. One was light from a kind of skylight looking out a window, though, as a kind of inevitability, a kind of disbelief in the unreached. The city would arrive, plastered on starlight, inching its way along the skylight, became a wish. But to put that text, those concrete words, city, wave, on an interior, to put light and shadow in the interior, and a corner no less, a kind of gathering refusal. We can very well picture the wave, the city, but to picture the wave, the city, and the corner at once, the nonsensical shadows. Speculation is vital here. I don't mean this morally, but necessarily and structurally. What we call impossible, we mean often quite something else. A love appears impossible because the conditions to allow for it require the assent of someone who is currently dissenting. Revolution or liberation may appear impossible because not enough commit to the conditions of realizing it. It is a reduction of polarity I am making up, I know. But I do so because impossibilities do exist, I believe. One's not contingent on the will or position of others. I mean the old impossibilities. A god makes a rock she can't lift, square circles, to be able to speak without place or breath. These recesses felt by implication. Speculation exists in the former, and that unlikeliness of assent, of what would be impossible had conditions been otherwise, if we could reach but a little further. Or, put another way, the impossible is like two parallel lines that will never touch, while speculation is like an asymptote, always getting closer. This is not to deny both are unreachable, it is rather to affirm suddenly we may find the latter, the truth of a thing, the conditions changed, something ruined, people circling in a square. There is a letter in a kind of drawer that I will not read. I remember vaguely, though, beginning a kind of circle, multiplying to become a coil, and then harshly an S began to grow around it. Hard spikes began to push through, forming dots of feather. My mother once gave me this blanket, finished before I was born, knitted pink, white, blue, along with a seal for sealing letters, with the distinct insignia of a ladybug at the tip. I remember vaguely turning these shapes on the letter into an image of a peacock, my best try anyways, pressing into the letter, and knowing one day I will know. Thanks for indulging me. Now I'm going to speak some to field. So let's turn to this, the first poem in the collection field, and think of the space of the poem, its graphic, its grapheme, its grammar, its genre, its gender. A note first, before we begin, though, about the spelling of words in field. Field inhabits what I was hoping to be a kind of speculative language, with reference points to, yes, Middle English, but also internet speak, my own poetic idiosyncrasies. Some of the effects for me, and here I should add, all of this is very much my opinion, me talking about my work, and it is certainly not for me alone, or even primarily to decide what is happening in these poems, as I'm, after all, quite biased. I like my poems. But some of the effects of the spelling are worth mentioning, I think. First, one has to, as a reader, literally figure out how to read them. This is pleasurable to me as a reader, aesthetically, but also necessary, a quite usual part of life, moving about and through a language that may not always fit, or that renders certain objects unreachable. So here we have an alternate language with alternate unreachable objects. Second, relationships open up across the words. Not just ones here like in, which appears like INN in, as in a place to take up residence, which, if we're looking only to denotation, may seem somewhat arbitrary or not essential, but also in where the eye is drawn, the relationships that are highlighted, the new relationships that emerge. For instance, I am instantly drawn towards the repetition of in a way, had it been spelled with one N, I may not have noticed. I also relate it to common here, as both repeat a letter similarly, and the EN here of common even stands out as having a kind of rhyme with in, which of course was always there, but now I am slowed down to it in a way perhaps I wouldn't have been before. Third, and perhaps most importantly for me, I see trans things. I see things about being trans. Maybe less in this poem than others, though I do have tall women and names and skirts and things. And I see in them a language and form that appears distant and old by this respelling, far off. I see in them something that feels like it's making a claim on me as a reader. It's declaring a kind of classicality. But I know, living in the world that I do, the world that we do, that is not something trans women are afforded or are for or are continuous with. I know this is not our everydayness. I know history is something, I am told, and have been shown, is foreclosed to me. Trans women are technological, new, invented, aberrant, I am told. We don't constitute things, we deviate from things. So looking at it, I feel a loss. I feel a deep loss at the mere appearance of these things in this manner. Now on to specifically this poem and its sort of graphic qualities. It wasn't until late in the process of Field that I wrote this particular poem that opens the collection. And it took me even till later on before I decided to open the collection with it. Field uses a few different forms visually throughout, but here, this classically lyric-looking thing, a couple lines pushing against it, but largely contained, seemed like how to begin. There's something of Pound's cantos, or at least a canto, a place, a character, a scene. It quickly opens up, however, to include other people, a grackle in the garden roost. And quickly it becomes quite crowded, women and vegetables and turnips. There's an affect of the high lyric only to be disturbed by these idyllic or pastoral qualities, animals, marts, parts. Then there's that line, the saddened powers we rub, so economically, which escapes, climbs out of the scene, and tonally is quite distinct from what precedes it. We trail back, stumbling to the concrete, the image, the figure, the speaker, the place. And I'll read the poem. I'm also going to read sort of in a more classical reading manner, where I just sort of read poems that I like that seem appropriate to the space. But then I wrote down some comments to speak to specifically the graphic nature of them that I'll return to as we continue. These white skirts and orange sweaters I want in the feeding mart, while my vegetable parts bloom in the common way, a grackle in the garden roost. The tall women washing hands or eyeing turnips, the saddened powers we rub so economically. In one version of things, alarum is my name. Unkempt and handled, I am hoarse, I am saddled, I am a broken horse. I realized as I was writing this talk that I do this thing a lot where I have one line that like sticks out that refuses to conform to the form that I like imposed on it. And it's always like a real twisted the knife kind of line, you know, where I'm trying to be like a vulnerable or something. So thank you to this talk for allowing me to realize that about my own work. And this one's not going to have a visual. 15. When ambience accidentally presents as a girl sweating at my teat, I wanted to love her accidents, 2 power lines cut vertical in the grass, my lyric untied in her hand, clinical like spring. Is there anything you love, sis, more than an antecedent? It is pleasing to understand labor as a field, a felt passed through. I would see you, green, in that land. When I first began writing the work that would become Field, I pictured like prose blocks, you know, just solid blocks of text that would slowly break apart until by the end you had like these very dispersed, disintegrated, wider landscape forms. Instead, as I was writing it, I ended up opting for this kind of, depending on the poem and the context, what shape it was to take. But as I was doing that, it occurred to me for the first time how odd prose is, how strange it is to think of the line as an abstract thing, to have no end, to consider the page not to be the limit, but to think of the paragraph as the limit, to have where the line begins or ends not be of concern, but the thought of it. It seemed like an odd thing to let a printing press, a laptop, decide where to break. But of course there is to this abstraction something beautiful, a history and a connotation. So for me here, I wanted that effect of the prose, and yet a break happens to the prose, partially to remind you what you're in, that you're in this work, and how you got there, but also to obstruct it. 16. Gender is not the tran organ. Gender is, yes, a hemorrhage. The name script and state script proceed lapping the milk in my sacks. Gender, like all surface, is a female depository room. In that cloud Moses wept, and we expect a law. His face like light, and our bodies golden in vaginoplasticity. If you ever get down my mountain, he said, purge me with hyssop. Offer my bullock on the altar. A tran is nothing but the sense of some burning. I alone have escaped to tell you this. Being graceless, my breasts folding for the first, the cruelest rhetoric, forgiveness, and their big brown beards like pubic slug, I must remember, please keep your hands to yourself. I mean this ontologically. Nature is somewhere else. This next poem, poem 24, is the first poem that I wrote for the collection. It's a prose block. It was the first one that I imagined breaking apart slowly. And it's sort of the most matter-of-fact, I think. Being tran is a unique kind of organ. I am speeching materially. I am speeching about heredity. A tran enters through the hole gloams in the linden. A tran enters ether like a moth. While tran precedes essence, her form is contingent on the field. The manner sits within a field. We speech into the ether, while the moth blooms in the yucca. I also became excited as I was writing it just to write things about trees and moths and flowers and all these sorts of things. And sort of as I mentioned earlier, there was this sense that I realized I had within me. Maybe it was my own idiosyncratic thing or was from, I don't know, having been taught to think this way, but to think that like the natural world was not whatever the natural world was not something to write about for maybe someone like me or maybe just in general. So I also found this pleasure as I was writing it and writing in this kind of way that highlighted new things, that there's this very strong pleasure of just being able to sit with the beauty of an object and describe it. 28. Pox in the pewter again, gash in that syntax. A tran, her name, some flint, already in the ash. I can't stop writing tran, her double name. The boys coal into a natural row. The garden they flatten when they pass to what? This morning I saw you. A bell spilt in a field, only there was no field, and a cathedral is not its bell, but some ringing, no name but to reckon with the ringing. My breasts groan, a bell I tend, and it's stunning, a thing before it's gone. I wanted to include this one, 33, because I feel, as I had shown with the first poem, poem 1, and the previous 16, somewhere between this like high lyric and then prose. I think this sits like pretty well in between them, this poem. It's one line is out of line, the ribbon there, pieces are seemingly missing, yet there's still a left and a right adjustment. The poem seems old, ruined, sapphic, a kind of fragment. 33. I care so much about the word I can't read. It marks my back when I pass with a ribbon in my hair. Under the principled sky, there is no vulnerability, only what protrudes. And these lions licking my wound, expecting to find a wound. There is history in this wood. $45. But when I was a child, I was so old. In my dreams, a girl. There being no pardon from the real, its form, a dream, a girl. The field is an affect, yes. But what matters more than its fact? Factual the fold, in its fallow and bent day. Mattering how we call a thing, and what did we make then, being so tall, the day being old, some facts stunning the air. This poem was the first one which a word occurred to me that I mentioned earlier, abstraction. Poems at times feel fragmented, erased, composites, things that have been made to feel not only crafted, but then further somehow imposed on, as if by accident or by another. It's not uncommon for a poem to reveal multiple layers of time in this way. With this poem, I had this feeling, and perhaps this is a fault of mine as a reader, but of not having encountered a poem that was quite obstructed or intentionally covered up, rather than intentionally removed from. And for me, this poem feels, despite being a flat object, like there's another object in front of it, kind of a white square that's coming down from the left into it. The words are not clipped, but they seem to have moved to accommodate or to have happened into a shape, with some square thing ahead of it, jutting in front of it. I think of May's eavesdroppers or similar paintings. There's a 17th century tradition of Dutch painting where there's like a person pulling back a veil, usually a servant or maid, to reveal a scene of oftentimes two bourgeois lovers having an affair or something behind a curtain. And the servant is staring directly at you, eyes into your eyes as a viewer looking at the painting. And to me, I felt like with this, what I was thinking of and hopefully going for, the upper left-hand corner of the work, this space is a kind of veil, a drawing back, a curtain, and this thing before us is the scene that gets revealed. $47. I wanted so much to speech the human things. I became the bird suit they sent me in. This is what makes us girls, thinning by the hour. $50. Nothing is equivalent to itself. In this city, a tran is heard only as interchangeability. Any day now, her stomach a shrinking, possible thing. What the day might allow her, light clinging to the green of a sea. Any day now, she says, any day. 55. The bit provides its horse. The rock provided a boy, blessing God. I wanted one secret, but for the rod in this my longish throat. I know no new way to speech this, the power of lions. I don't have tons to add to this poem, but I wanted to show it to you. I wanted to include it as it's very small, and I like very small things. It's personally my favorite of the collection. It's also a love poem. It's an elegiac one about loss, but a love poem nonetheless, which I find the hardest to write. And as I was writing Field, I felt it needed something like this at the moment that it was at, because it was getting #dark. So I wanted something to kind of lift the reader. We have a few already characterized qualities in terms of the shape of it. Left adjusted text, a longer line that's also breaking through. The references here, though, are a little less public, a little less high lyric and more intimate. The shape of it, perhaps more akin to George Herbert or Dickinson than to the empire of Pound or Roman antiquity. 56. Speeching of trees from the inside, you can grow dear to one only from the inside. I took pride in what was dropped. When nothing was in sight, my pride was in your leaves, where medallions could be. So I'm going to read 3 more, 2 without a visual, and then 1 more with a visual, and then we can do Q&A. This poem, 57, what to say about it? I wrote it during a month in 2014, September, during which 3 people who I knew, friends of mine, 2 through online and 1 was a closer friend, who were all trans women, died. 2 by their own hand, and the caveat, what moves a hand, and then 1 was murdered. And there was also this statistic that was going around on Facebook that people were sharing, that was the life expectancy of a trans woman is 27. We got to do something about this, which I don't think that's a true statistic. Maybe it is, I don't know. But regardless, the effect of that, the effect of sharing it and feeling the need to share this fact in context of the world that I was in at the time, that we all were. I don't know, I wrote this out of that. 57. Tonight, I would love to write the moth in the garden, to grieve it. And as a matter of form, did you know, not a month goes by, a tran I know doesn't die. Just shy of 27, it's such a pleasure to be alive in this trembled suit you lent. Shock is a structured response, a word lost in the mouth of keepers. And you thumb at the moth, a dozen bees. I tethered these nights. I gathered so many trees. And then both with the book and with this talk, I wanted to hopefully lead us to something, not like a kind of bad faith, progressivist, liberal hope or something like, well, everything's getting better though, and it'll all work out. Because, I don't think these things are inevitable. They require action and determination, but I also do think possibility exists, and that's partially what I was hoping the earlier talk would kind of work around too, with the idea of something being unreachable until suddenly it's not, until suddenly one can extend one's hand and feel it and take it in. Precious, every light, dying into a cindered heart, its ashy ring. I am an arrangement of strings, deferred what remains of a fire, latent in any wood. And you, a rushed thing, singeing what you could of my dry strings. It's good. It means we can change. And this will be the last poem of the evening, where once I imagined this whole project beginning with a prose block, it oddly enough ended up closing with one. I feel like this is the most abstract, which is why I felt the prose was fitting, while also being a little more narrative. It's a kind of epilogue stepping back out into the world after having looked back behind one to see what's ahead. 60. I awoke one morning to see the whole world of things before me. I woke to see all things, save the things not before me. I awoke and gathered the spoils to a mound in a field. I speeched to my husband, better to be a thing than a gatherer of things. We were so national, a hoard and its hand, sprouting garments off plums and gathering their leaves. One morning I, with my people, gathered fallen leaves to the field and woke to see one plum leaf hang like an eye straying to boys and certain things, or away to a plum, its spoiled tree. Thank you.
All right. At this time, we will be doing Q&A. If anyone has any questions, please just raise your hand. We have a couple mics going around the house.
Hi. I'm curious about the choice to just use numeric titles and Roman numerals specifically. What do you think that accomplishes?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. The Roman numerals increasingly, I feel, exist to make it difficult for me to read them because I don't remember very well how to read them. But I think that's an effect of that idea of a kind of classicality of no place, even though, of course, Roman numerals have a very specific place in history. But it lends itself to that sort of high lyric feel, I think. And that's reflected, I think, in a number of the sort of big early modernist projects, whether that's the cantos or Patterson or or these sort of different works that oftentimes are serial, longer works of place. And I wanted to kind of reference and play with some of those things, although hopefully not, be a fascist like Pound, but yeah.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? All right, well, just you have one more?
Got one right back here.
Hey, thank you. Hi.
Hi.
I'm curious to know if it ever, in the writing process or in the performance process, since it's so graphically like decentering to come to the page, if there was a reason or if there was an approach that you made towards sound and how the work may or may not be also like performed in such a way that heightened that. I mean, I noticed that you didn't, so I guess I'm curious about if there had ever been a thought process about that.
Yeah. I had thought at a time of reading it in kind of a Middle English, affectation, but two things. Oh, no, absolutely, no, a few things. One, I think that would be a great performance, and I'm all for it. But my anxiety was I get really, I don't know, that I would like do disservice or something to Middle English somehow, not like who cares, but I felt that kind of anxiety with that. And then also I don't know, I feel like a reading is like I'm sharing something with you all, and I want you all to have it, and I want to make it available as much as I can. So maybe if I was presenting at like a, I don't know, a medieval conference or something, then maybe I would. That might be more interesting then. But I feel like, given that there's multiple levels of intelligibility, the most legible, the most immediate and approachable, I thought was the one that I should commit to in the reading.
Got one right here.
With the, thank you for all this. With the incorporation of fusing the Middle English inspiration with more contemporary spelling choices and syntactical choices, can you speak to how that relates to the, you mentioned something about trans identity. You said it so beautifully. You said like it's not it like delineate, or it derives or
Deviates. Yeah.
thank you, deviates from, as opposed to it constitutes. And so I was wondering if you can speak to this really interesting incorporation of history and contemporary, like the historicity of your work with regards to the erasure of trans identity and history, and that relationship, if however you want to take that.
Yeah, thank you. I will try my best to answer. Yeah, history and erasure. I'll solve it. Yeah, no, I know. Yeah. Yeah, I think my impulse, more than towards like, oh, we should all go out and read Chaucer now or something, was more along the lines of reading when I was younger for the first. I remember in my high school, which was like a private evangelical Christian kind of half homeschool, half kind of thing. So there was this library, but it was small, and they didn't have lots of good books. I don't know why I was trying to be careful. They didn't have good books. And one of the things that they did have, though, was Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and the Pearl, as translated by Tolkien, on the grounds that I guess because they had Tolkien for other things. And I remember finding that and having no idea how to read any of it. And it had on the left side the Old English. I had no idea how to read any of that. But there was, because I was a nerd, I was fascinated and wanted to know how to read this. And also, used bookstores were another big thing of finding things that you have no idea what they are and trying to figure out how you're supposed to read them. And just coming to read as a child in general is such a, struggle in any kind of language or multiple languages. And so that was part of the impetus, too, of the sort of coming to read. And sorry, my phone is vibrating so hard right now. I should have turned it off. But yeah, so and I was just talking with Lindsay about when I want to know what the good used bookstores are here. That's what I want to do with my time while I'm here. I want to go walk around them, look at books. And that was sort of how I discovered a lot of things. That's how I found collected works of Chaucer that I read. And there is something about that coming to write and coming to read that gives me pleasure as a reader, that I hope that there are other readers out there who derive pleasure from that as well. Yeah, does that kind of answer? Got distracted by the phone, I'm sorry. Any final question, maybe? One more?
Inappropriate to ask, but I'd love to hear more about you personally.
Mhm.
You mentioned your religious educational
yeah.
background and your discovery,
Mhm.
sort of by happenstance of.
Yeah.
Anyway, you've piqued.
Oh, yeah, to speak to that?
I'd like to
Yeah.
hear more. And where you're from, because you said you just came to Chicago.
Oh, yeah, I'm from Southern California. I grew up, I was born in Long Beach and grew up in Santa Ana there. Yeah, to speak to that. Yeah, so in that space, in sort of Santa Ana area, there's there's quite a bit, like a conservative evangelical Christian base. It's kind of like, I don't know, if like Austin is the liberal center of, I don't know, Texas, I don't know if that's true. If Tucson is the liberal center of Arizona, Orange County is the conservative center of California. It's the inverse, you know. It's like, I think it was like 78% or something voted for Trump. It's like a very conservative area. Yeah, so I mean, that's what I grew up in. There's a lot of bad, a lot of violent and evil things, but I also learned some things that I think are helpful. There's also a part of me that's a pretty shy, quiet person. I like to keep to myself. And who was I talking to? I was talking to someone who grew up in like a very middle class secularist atheist household, right? And they were talking about like when they were in junior high, talking to their mother and father about sex and sexuality and so on. And like if I did that, I would have hated that so much. So I'm very thankful that I didn't have to experience hearing about my parents' sex life in junior high. So like, not to say you throw it all up in the air, because what's that compared to a lot of the violent and hostile beliefs? But I don't know. Can I speak to it in a more specific way that you're looking for? Is that all right? Yeah, I don't want to talk to my parents about their sex life. That's, I guess, my answer to that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Cool. That seems like a perfect note to end on. Yeah. All right.
Thank you
you
all
so
for
much.
attending today.
Thank you
Just
all.
as a reminder, we will be doing some book signing up at the top floor. Unfortunately, we have no more copies of Field available for sale currently, but we will have book plates that you can get signed in.